Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. The allegations of rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other offenses against women seem to be coming from everywhere. The abuses occur on campuses, in corporate boardrooms, in newsrooms, on movie locations, in the home. Some of the figures caught up in these scandals are world famous: Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, Kevin Spacey. Others are not well known at all: a college roommate, a newspaper editor, the boy next door. Just how widespread are these terrible events, and what do we need to do about them? I will ask my guest, Dorchen Leidholdt, Director of Battered Women's Legal Services at Sanctuary for Families, and Sonia Ossorio, the President of New York Now, the National Organization for Women in New York City. Welcome. Thank you for coming in. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
Because of the intensified media coverage, these stories seem to be coming from everywhere. The issues are hardly new, but our awareness, I think, is being heightened lately. So Sonia, maybe you can start by giving us a little perspective on what we're seeing. I mean, put the events, the many events that we're seeing, in some sort of context.
Well, it's been quite a year. Think about a year ago, we elected Donald Trump to the White House. Many of us thought it would never happen after we heard his comments on the bus about how when you're famous, that you can molest women with impunity. And then we went Roger Ailes at Fox, and Bill O'Reilly, and most recently Harvey Weinstein. And I think what's really startling for a lot of people is that everybody seemed to know and to think about the complicity that was around all of these people, that it allowed it to fester and infect those workplaces. So if you think about, it's been 25 years since Anita Hill. That was 1991. And that was really the first time that we started using sexual harassment as, a lexicon in language, and really was in the public consciousness. And as Dorchen fully knows, sometimes it takes 25 years for movements to happen. Look at domestic violence. Really took a long time for that to happen. So I think that we're at a tipping point now, and we're really on the cusp of seeing a lot change. If
Awareness is being heightened, and if we are at a tipping point, what would you like to see happen as a result of this heightened awareness? The publicity is all well and good, but sometimes these issues can just come and go. In this case, you don't want it to just go and nothing happen, but what would you like to see happen?
Well, I think in addition to seeing domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, sex trafficking in particular, in the news as never before, I think what we are realizing is how inadequate the response of our systems have been, and I think our justice system in particular, to these different forms of violence against women. What we're learning is that this is a majority experience. The New York Times has an article that says that something like 87% of women have reported sexual harassment in the workplace. So often sexual harassment is trivialized. And in fact, not only does it harm women economically in grave and long-lasting ways, but sexual harassment often looks like rape. One of a very important case that went to the Supreme Court in 1986, it involved a bank teller who was being systematically raped by her boss. So think about it. But I think that there's been a problem. The public does not until now, perhaps this is beginning to change, recognize the gravity, the seriousness of gender violence, these different forms of violence against women. And our systems, while there's been improvement, meaningful improvement, still have not begun to address different forms of gender-based violence effectively. And we're talking about a whole array of systems. We can start with the justice system, the criminal justice system in particular, but we also have to look at how our educational system is addressing gender-based violence, for example, how employers are addressing gender-based violence. We have a lot of work to be done. I think that's one of the big lessons that we are learning now. Much work needs to happen. We have a movement out there, but that movement, and there are clear gains, I don't want to minimize them, but so much more needs to happen.
If we look at the most serious cases, the cases of rape, the cases of sexual assault, these are criminal acts. How well or not well does our criminal justice system deal with these issues?
I think it depends on where you are in the country, what district attorney's office, what law enforcement, even down to the precinct that you're in. Mm-hmm. Of course, on a macro level, when leadership makes it a priority, they can do a really good and thorough job. Some of the things that we see are lacking is sufficient training at the law enforcement level and also at the prosecutorial level as well. And Dorchen can speak a lot to even at the, when we're talking about in courtrooms and how much judges have needed to be trained to see things through a gender lens. So, even we've worked here on the issue of human trafficking. There's been a lot of progress in terms of legislation and passing laws. And very often, I think those are the first places that things change. And then policy catches up, and then culture changes. But it just does not filter down to the police on the beat. We don't see where they're using the latest techniques for interviewing victims. Mm-hmm. We see that there still is bias in how they are viewing those victims, that they still think of real rape as when there's a stranger involved who's jumping out of the woods, right. And the victim is, the school teacher heading to her first day of school, right. Or something.
Our criminal justice system has a long way to go. I think there's a little bit of a sense of the nature of the problem, but still domestic violence, sexual assault is not taken terribly seriously. And I think one of the problems is some people say there's an epidemic of violence against women and girls. I think in reality it's endemic. It's been happening for a long period of time. It's been accepted, often as inevitable, even by our criminal justice system. And so what we see, and I see on a daily basis at Sanctuary for Families last year assisted 17,000 victims of different forms of gender-based violence, mostly domestic violence.
This is in New York City?
In New York City. And
that's 17,000.
17,000. And, we pride ourselves in New York City in having one of the best justice systems in the country. And we still see a justice system that is not addressing this situation appropriately, is not sufficiently responsive. And what happens with many, many of these cases, and just to talk about district attorney's offices, domestic violence cases, and we know how serious they are, how devastating they are to the victims, to children in families, to communities. We're now beginning to see the link between mass violence and even terroristic violence and domestic violence. As an article in the New York Times demonstrated, domestic violence, the vast majority of cases result in violations, pleas to violations, which are not even crimes, or something called an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, which means there is an ultimate dismissal after a certain period of time. I think what would change that in terms of our justice system is the commission of many, many more resources. That means district attorney's offices need much larger domestic violence units. NYPD needs, as you point out, Sonia, force-wide training, because every single police officer on the beat or in an RMP is going to encounter domestic violence or sexual assault. And are they equipped to address it? Not currently. So we have a lot of work to be done.
Now, in many, maybe even in most cases, no criminal charges are filed. Offenses are not reported, and yet the women who are the victims in these cases, they still have to live with the experience that they went through. What are some of the consequences of gender violence, and what are the daily lives like for the women who don't report these crimes or incidents of harassment?
Well, I think whether they report them or not, the impacts can be devastating on an individual's life. And of course, every person is different, but the levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, the symptoms that people are living with, supposedly 94% of women who've been assaulted experience it in some way, shape, or form. And that could be for a number of weeks after an assault to it affecting them for years. I mean, I have met women who the resources aren't there for therapy. If going to the criminal justice system at times can be re-traumatizing. They can be treated with such a lack of respect and sensitivity that it's very regrettable that they even did come forward. Wow. So that is a really big problem that we're focusing on shedding some light on. But so many women never regain the jobs that they had, or find that in college they drop out of school, and it's just it can be a downward spiral. So it affects so many parts of their lives, how the relationships that they have moving forward.
And just to talk briefly about the impact on children, we're learning so much more about how exposure to domestic violence in the home affects children. Social scientists, neurobiologists are conducting research, and they're finding that there are serious long-term effects of being exposed to domestic violence. It really rewires in very detrimental ways children's neurological systems. It can detrimentally affect their intelligence quotient. It can affect their emotional functioning. So the consequences are quite severe. I mean, I think we can say that domestic violence really constitutes a public health crisis of major proportions. And when we look at the numbers of victims, between 1 out of 3 and 1 out of every 4 women will be exposed to domestic violence. About 1 out of 7 in New York City, a very conservative study showed, will experience severe domestic violence. So, and I think the point that you make, Sonia, about the fact that so often our criminal justice system's response ends up re-traumatizing victims is very well taken. I mean, NYPD is taking some steps to bring trauma-informed interviewing into its practice. That's pretty new. And I think we've seen our prosecutors' offices, all of them, they have a lot of work. Very often victims are treated really as almost the same way that perpetrators are treated, and they are subjected to a kind of cross-examination in order to determine whether or not this is a viable case, and are severely harmed in the process.
When these incidents or encounters occur in the workplace, it's almost always a severe power imbalance involved between the man and the woman. And for the woman, it's often her livelihood is at stake. In some cases, her entire career may be at stake. What should we be saying to women who find themselves on the wrong side of this power imbalance? I mean, it's easy for someone watching television or even sitting here on the set to say, oh, you should just report this person, or you should bring charges or whatever. But what is the message that you go to the women who are in these situations?
Well, I think it helps to reach out to organizations like mine, and there's so many others providing advice to women? Well, certainly if you're in an abusive situation and in danger, do pick up that telephone and call 911. I mean, we've seen measurable improvement in police response. They're much more likely to arrest the perpetrator these days. That means the issuance of an order of protection. That can be life-saving for victims and their children. And too often, domestic violence results in intimate partner homicide. So in spite of the problems with police response, do call 911. But it's a really tough decision for a victim to make, and I think it really helps to have an informed advocate to sit down and talk about what's going on. So there's so many options. There's a civil justice option, perhaps going into family court to get a civil order of protection. Do you initiate a case under New York State's sexual harassment law? I think getting advice from experts can be very helpful.
And in the case of the guys who are the offenders in these cases, we've seen now with all the news, we've seen a lot of corporations who are very quick to suspend alleged offenders or even to fire them. Is that enough? I mean, what should happen to men in the workplace who are harassing women? Is it enough to just lose your job, or should there be more severe consequences?
Well, I think that it's certainly sending a message to the harassers out there that it's a different era now and you're very likely to lose your job. But we have to stop thinking of it as one bad apple type of a scenario. And I do believe that we're at that point where companies, both small and large, are going to take this much, much more seriously. I don't even know if the Weinstein Company is going to survive. And that's what corporations are really up against, is you may in fact, have the bottom fall out of your enterprise. In the intervening years between Anita Hill and now, there has been a lot of good work done on the legal front and also on the policy front in terms of businesses. There are many ways to make it work to change the culture and have a reporting system that really can work. From having a third-party clearinghouse, you can have anonymous reporting. You can do certain things in your training that incentivizes people, bystanders, to report rather than what most people think there's going to be a retaliation. So the good news is there has been a lot of scholarly work and work being done in companies, and there are companies that are doing right. One of our hopes is that we'll be able to spotlight those companies that are doing a good job, and others can learn from it. And another issue is also mandatory arbitration. I think that it has not helped the situation of protecting sexual harassment, keeping it secret in the workplace, and there's really been a movement. I mean, this was an issue that now worked on probably close to 20 years ago, seeing the onslaught of having employees sign mandatory arbitration.
Which just limits their options completely. Yeah.
It keeps everything secret, and it limits their opportunities to fight for their rights in court. So there is legislation federally that would look to remove some of those clauses from employment contracts.
And again, there's a power imbalance. I mean, because you come in, you're a new potential employee, you're not even an employee yet, and you don't have a choice. I mean, you can sign this or you can move on.
Yeah, I mean, a power imbalance is the common thread that really unites all these different forms of gender-based violence. I mean, we see it. I mean, what domestic violence is about at the core is an abuser wielding power and control over another. And we've seen really injurious effects even without physical violence. It's really that domination, that day-to-day domination that often erodes a victim's self-esteem. And we were talking about the health effects. I mean, what we're seeing, the long-term health effects of being subjected to power and control is it often shows up in all kinds of serious chronic health problems by the time a woman reaches middle age. But we're seeing that same power imbalance in the Harvey Weinstein type situation. Right. In human trafficking cases, sex trafficking in particular is all about complete domination and actual enslavement. That's an extreme form of gender-based violence. But understanding that this is fundamentally about power and control, principally over women, and is a key factor in the continued inequality of women in our society. That's, I think, one of the big takeaways that we're beginning to see at this point.
You know, and putting the economic toll on our communities from the gender-based violence is truly, truly significant.
Yes.
And if we could shed more light on that for people, yes, it should be more of a priority, if not for anything but that.
And so often it's the women who are in fact the breadwinners, who are raising families, who are supporting children, and the grievous toll to their economic viability throughout their lifetimes. I mean, that, I think, there needs to be much more conversation about that when we think about the devastating impact to individuals, to families, to communities.
We have just a couple of minutes left. If you could just wave a magic wand and money was no object, and you wanted to do something substantial about this gender-based violence against women and girls, where would you start?
I would start in school, and from the very earliest ages. You know, there's always age-appropriate lessons that can be made on what consent is, mm-hmm, what manhood is, anger management, de-escalation, and many things. These are really so important for the future of our children and how they understand equality and personal space and self-control. I think it's probably more valuable than anything that we could be teaching, right, our children. And I would have that as part of every single classroom.
And if you start early enough, it becomes the norm. Mm-hmm. Dorchen?
And I totally agree with you, Sonia. I think I would start there as well. But I think I would also, I mean, there's so many people who are being left out. We're hearing about the voices of women who are educated, who are professional women, who are making decent incomes. And I think we're still failing to reach in a significant way, or hearing from women of color, women and girls who have been in situations of foster care. And I think I would say a vibrant public education campaign that in multiple languages that really gets the word out in a meaningful way. And then I think we have more services in New York City than ever before. We have family justice centers, for example, in every borough that are places where victims of domestic violence and human trafficking can go. But they are really struggling to meet the demand. The demand is enormous. And if we really create awareness and get the word out, especially to women in impoverished communities, women are struggling, women who work in fast food restaurants, women who live in housing projects, the demand is enormous, and we have to be equipped as a society to address the needs. When we provide assistance to a mother, we often stop the cycle for the children. The kids are not being exposed to domestic violence, and so we need to begin to be fully equipped to address this widespread public health crisis and go where the need is greatest. And we're moving in that direction, but we have a long way to go.
I'd also love to see automatic voting registration. We elect our district attorneys, and they have so much discretion over our lives and what crimes are prioritized. Right. When we have human trafficking that needs to be investigated and 30 reports of rape on any given Friday and Saturday in New York City, and not enough special victims officers to handle it.
Right. So we've run out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. I wish we had more time. Yeah. Dorchen Leidholdt, Sonia Ossorio, thank you so much for coming in. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Do you ever stay in a hotel or motel? Do you leave a tip for the housekeeper who cleans your room each day? It's customary to tip the person who helps you with your bags or gets you a cab or rolls in the tray with your room service order. But most people pretty much ignore the woman, it's almost always a woman, who changes the bed linens and the towels and vacuums the floor and scrubs the toilet and the bathtub and so on. Fewer than a third of all hotel guests leave a tip for the housekeeper, according to the American Hotel and Lodging Association. We're not talking about a lot of money here, maybe $3 or $5 a day. Cleaning up after hotel guests is not a fun job. Garbage has to be removed and sometimes medical waste, and housekeepers always have to be on the alert for abusive behavior. They're paid little enough and benefits are scarce. They rely on tips to help pay for food and other essential expenses for themselves and their families. If you can afford to leave a $5 bill and a note that says thanks, do it. It'll be appreciated. That's all for now. See you next time.